Okay, sit down for this one, because what just leaked out of a Los Angeles courthouse is about to blow the entire D4vd case wide open, and I promise you, nobody, and I mean nobody, saw this coming. For 5 straight months, everything connected to D4vd's murder case was buried behind a wall of total secrecy. Not a hearing. Not a headline. Not one single leaked page. And now, out of nowhere, the sealed vault has cracked open, and what's crawling out of it is going to change how every single person watching this video understands the case against him. Word is now confirmed, not 1, not 2, but 3 separate grand juries quietly sat behind closed doors and heard testimony connected to D4vd across 18 different days. 18. Spread out over November, December, and February, in a pattern nobody knew existed until this very moment. And here's where it gets almost impossible to explain away. After all of that, after 18 days of testimony spread across 3 grand juries, prosecutors did not walk out with an indictment against D4vd. They walked towards something completely different. So buckle up, because by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly why July 21st might be the single most explosive date this case has produced yet. Let's back up for anyone just catching up to the story, because the pieces you're about to hear only make sense once you know the full picture. A 15-year-old girl named Celeste Rivas Hernandez was found dead inside a Tesla registered to the singer known as D4vd. He was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty, and he has remained behind bars while the legal process ground forward at what looked, from the outside, like a painfully slow pace. His attorneys have already staked out their position publicly, stating flatly that the actual evidence will show their client did not kill Celeste Rivas Hernandez, and that he was not the cause of her death. That's the defense's official stance heading into all of this. Meanwhile, that much about the arrest and the charge has been public knowledge for a while now. But what actually happened after the arrest, in the rooms nobody was allowed to see into, has been locked up tight, until this new release finally cracked the seal. Here's the timeline nobody had until now, and it is wild once you actually lay it out. In November, a grand jury convened for 5 days. Then, after what looks like a holiday break, they came back in December for another 5 days. January appears to have been skipped entirely, maybe the only quiet stretch this case has had since it began. Then in February, they returned for the longest run yet, 8 full days. Add it all up and you land on 18 total days of grand jury testimony tied directly to D4vd and the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. 18 days. 3 grand juries. 5 months of total silence. And somehow, still no indictment. Now, before you say, okay, so what, let me explain exactly why this detail is sending shockwaves through legal circles watching D4vd's case. A grand jury exists to do one specific job: help prosecutors figure out whether they have enough to move forward, and often enough, whether they have enough to hand down an indictment right then and there. When a grand jury does return an indictment, prosecutors usually get to skip an entire stage of the legal process, the preliminary hearing, and jump straight toward trial preparation. That's the fast lane. That's the expected outcome after 18 days of testimony across 3 separate panels. And it is not what happened with D4vd. Instead, after 3 grand juries and 18 days behind closed doors, prosecutors chose a completely different road. They are now preparing for a preliminary hearing, the exact process that a successful indictment is designed to let you skip. On paper, that's allowed. Prosecutors can pick whichever legal path they believe gives them the strongest footing. But stack that decision against 18 days of grand jury testimony connected to the case, and you get a question that practically writes itself: what happened in those rooms that made prosecutors walk toward a preliminary hearing instead of walking out with an indictment? Nobody outside that courthouse has a confirmed answer, and legal observers following the case are just as puzzled as everyone else. One attorney who has spoken publicly about the proceedings summed up the confusion perfectly: it doesn't make sense to him, and it doesn't make sense to other people connected to the case either, because if you're already going to the trouble of convening a grand jury, the obvious next move is to walk out with an indictment. Skipping that step, after 18 days of testimony, is the part nobody can fully explain. One theory circulating heavily right now: maybe the grand jury simply wasn't convinced enough to hand down an indictment, and prosecutors decided a public preliminary hearing gives them a stronger stage to lay their case out for a judge, the defense, and eventually an actual jury. Another theory: maybe there's a strategic reason that has nothing to do with weakness at all, Maybe prosecutors wanted flexibility to keep gathering evidence without locking themselves into a formal indictment they'd have to defend later. And here's a detail a lot of casual followers of D4vd's case don't realize: losing at a grand jury once doesn't slam the door shut forever. Prosecutors can go back. They can bring new evidence. They can try again. So if that's really an option, why didn't they take it? Why go through 18 days of testimony across 3 separate grand juries connected to D4vd and never take what legal insiders are now calling at least one real shot at an indictment? That unanswered question is exactly why this update matters so much. For 5 months, the public knew almost nothing concrete about what was happening inside this case. We knew grand juries existed somewhere in the background, but we didn't know how many, how often, or across how many total days. Now we finally have the number, 18, and instead of closing the book on any mystery, it has cracked open 10 new ones. There's also a wrinkle in the terminology itself that's worth pausing on. Some legal analysts following the case have pointed out that what convened here may have functioned more like an investigative grand jury than a classic indicting grand jury, a body assembled to help investigators gather testimony and organize evidence, rather than one built from the outset to hand down formal charges. If that's accurate, it would help explain why 18 days of testimony didn't automatically translate into an indictment. But it doesn't fully resolve the mystery either, because as several attorneys have pointed out, a single grand jury can absolutely serve both functions at once, investigating and indicting in the same breath. Prosecutors aren't required to pick one or the other. So even with that wrinkle accounted for, the core question doesn't go away: why gather this much testimony and still walk away without paperwork that would have fast-tracked the entire case? So let's actually get into what a grand jury is built to do, because once you understand this, the strangeness of the situation becomes crystal clear. In serious criminal investigations, a grand jury gives prosecutors a private, secretive room to present evidence and hear testimony, completely shielded from cameras and public scrutiny. Its entire purpose boils down to one question: is there enough here to move forward? If yes, and the grand jury hands down an indictment, prosecutors typically skip the preliminary hearing entirely and head straight into arraignment and trial prep. It's faster. It's tighter. And in a case with this much public attention wrapped around D4vd, it also means fewer chances for details to leak before prosecutors are ready to present their full theory in open court. None of that happened here. Instead, D4vd's defense team is about to get its first real, public opportunity to challenge the prosecution's evidence, question witnesses directly, and start shaping the argument they plan to carry all the way into trial. That is a completely different legal road than the indictment and arraignment path, and it's the road prosecutors chose despite 5 months and 18 days worth of grand jury testimony already sitting quietly in the record. So what actually happened during those 18 days connected to D4vd? Honestly, we still don't fully know. The transcripts remain only partially available, and a judge has approved just a limited release, enough for prosecutors and D4vd's defense team to review the material as the case creeps toward its next major stage, but not enough for the rest of us to see everything yet. Still, the fact that this limited release even exists tells you something important. Whatever is inside those pages matters enough that both sides needed access before July 21st arrives. Whatever was said in those closed rooms is about to start shaping the public conversation around D4vd in a way it never has before. And that's not even the only bombshell hiding underneath this case. Before this preliminary hearing was scheduled, prosecutors quietly filed an unusually detailed court document laying out a large chunk of their theory against D4vd. This wasn't some routine paperwork. According to people who track filings like this in high-profile cases, it was surprisingly revealing, walking through prosecutors' timeline, their interpretation of the evidence, and hints at exactly how they plan to argue this case once real witnesses take the stand. Stop and think about that for a second. Prosecutors typically keep their full strategy locked down until testimony actually begins. Filing something this detailed before D4vd's preliminary hearing even started is not standard practice. Maybe it was strategic, locking in their narrative early, or applying pressure before the defense gets its first real crack at cross-examination. Or maybe it's simply the approach this particular team chose for this particular case. Either way, it's given the public its clearest look yet into how the state intends to argue that D4vd bears responsibility for the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. But here's the part everyone needs to hear clearly: a court filing is not the whole case. It's the prosecution's current position, not a full inventory of every piece of evidence connected to him that they've collected. More testimony, more documents, more evidence can still surface as this thing moves forward. Judging the entire strength of the case off one filing, before a single witness has faced cross-examination in open court, would be jumping the gun in a big way. And that's exactly why every set of eyes following this story is now locked onto July 21st, because that's the moment theory finally collides with live testimony, in front of a judge, in a room the public can actually watch. Let's really sit with how big that date is, because it deserves the attention. D4vd's preliminary hearing is scheduled to begin on July 21st, and it's expected to run somewhere between 3 and 5 days, a real, substantial hearing, not some rushed formality that wraps in an afternoon. For months, nearly everything tied to the grand jury investigation into D4vd stayed locked behind closed doors. The public got scraps, court filings, procedural updates, the occasional leak, but never the complete picture. That changes the second this hearing opens. This is the first moment prosecutors are required to present evidence live, in front of a judge, with D4vd's defense standing right there ready to challenge every single claim in real time. Across those 3 to 5 days, prosecutors have to convince the judge that there's enough evidence for the case against D4vd to keep moving, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not a verdict, just enough to justify pushing forward toward trial. That bar is lower than a conviction, sure, but it still forces prosecutors to put real witnesses on the stand, real evidence into the record, and real reasoning behind the theory they've been building since Celeste Rivas Hernandez was found dead inside that Tesla. Meanwhile, D4vd's defense finally gets a genuine shot at poking holes in that evidence, cross-examining witnesses, and signaling exactly how hard they intend to fight as this heads toward trial. Legal insiders following the case are already flagging just how unpredictable this hearing could get. One veteran defense attorney tracking the proceedings put it plainly, right now there are a lot of open questions, and we genuinely won't know how much evidence prosecutors plan to put on until the hearing actually starts, because nobody outside the prosecution's office knows their game plan. Is this going to be a fully detailed presentation, or is it going to be cursory, where they simply call a single police officer to the stand and move on? Nobody currently tracking this case can answer that with certainty. Some preliminary hearings are barely more than an officer reading a summary into the record, wrapped up in a single sitting. Others stretch into full witness lineups and expert testimony that essentially previews an entire trial strategy months in advance. It's also worth remembering that a formal legal brief isn't actually required for a preliminary hearing. Prosecutors can simply call witnesses and let the testimony speak for itself, which makes the earlier, unusually detailed filing even more curious in hindsight. Given that prosecutors already sank 18 days into 3 grand juries and still chose to file that document ahead of time, there's a real chance this hearing leans toward the more detailed version, closer to a trial preview than a formality, with testimony the public has genuinely never heard before. And that leaves us staring at 3 enormous open questions hanging directly over D4vd's case. Question 1. Will prosecutors introduce evidence connected to D4vd that has never been discussed publicly at all? Right now, almost everything anyone knows about this case has come from court filings and second-hand reporting. Preliminary hearings, by their very nature, tend to surface details that never made it into any prior document, testimony that reshapes timelines, evidence that clarifies exactly what investigators believe happened. If that happens here, July 21st could completely rewrite public understanding of the case against D4vd overnight. Question 2. How aggressively will the defense fight back, and what will D4vd's legal team finally reveal about their strategy? Up to this point, virtually the entire public narrative has centered on the prosecution's version of events. This hearing is the very first real opportunity for D4vd's defense to challenge specific pieces of evidence out loud, cross-examine the state's witnesses face-to-face, and start sketching out how they plan to fight this all the way to trial. That alone could shift public perception of D4vd dramatically, one way or the other. Question 3. What happens the second this hearing wraps? If the judge decides there's enough evidence, the case against D4vd rolls forward into its next stage, likely heading toward formal arraignment and eventually trial. But if unexpected motions, objections, or testimony surface during those 3 to 5 days, the entire trajectory of D4vd's case could shift in ways nobody watching right now can predict. This hearing might not be the end of any chapter, it might just be the loudest one yet. Here's the thread that ties this entire update together, and it's worth sitting with for a second. For months, the case against D4vd crept forward almost entirely out of sight. Sealed grand jury sessions. Confidential filings. Just enough scattered information leaking out to remind the public that something was still happening, without ever explaining what. That wall of silence is now cracking wide open. We know there were 3 separate grand juries. We know they met across 18 total days spanning November, December, and February. We know prosecutors chose not to pursue an indictment despite all of that testimony, and we know they are now heading straight into a preliminary hearing instead, a decision that, to this day, has never been publicly explained. None of that tells us how the case against D4vd finally ends. It doesn't tell us whether the judge will find enough evidence to move forward, or whether the defense is about to land a blow that reshapes the entire case. What it does tell us, loud and clear, is that this was never some rushed, sloppy investigation. Whatever you personally believe about D4vd, the record now shows months of methodical, deliberate work, testimony gathered, evidence reviewed, theories tested, long before a single public hearing was ever put on the calendar. And that's exactly why July 21st carries this much weight. It's not just another court date buried on a crowded legal calendar. It's the moment the entire case against D4vd stops being something we piece together from filings and finally becomes something the public can watch unfold live, witness by witness, objection by objection, in real time. For the first time since Celeste Rivas Hernandez's death was connected to D4vd, the public will get to watch prosecutors and the defense go head-to-head, out in the open, with a judge deciding whether this case has enough behind it to keep moving. There is still so much sitting in the dark. We don't know exactly what convinced prosecutors to skip an indictment after 18 days of testimony against D4vd. We don't know what's tucked inside the portions of the grand jury transcripts still sealed from public view. We don't know how hard the defense plans to come at the state's timeline once cross-examination actually starts. And honestly, we don't know if 3 to 5 days is even enough time to answer half the questions this case has stacked up since D4vd's name first became attached to it. But here's what we do know for certain: the next chapter begins on July 21st, and it's shaping up to be unlike anything this case has produced so far. After 5 months of silence, sealed files, and second-hand updates, the public is finally about to get a direct, unfiltered look at exactly how prosecutors plan to argue that D4vd is responsible for what happened to Celeste Rivas Hernandez, and exactly how his defense intends to push back. Whatever comes out of that courtroom over those 3 to 5 days could sharpen every question we currently have about D4vd, or blow the entire case open in a direction absolutely nobody is expecting right now. So here's exactly what we're going to do from here. As new filings drop, as testimony gets reported out of that courtroom, and as D4vd's preliminary hearing unfolds day by day, we're going to keep tracking every confirmed development in this case and separate what's actually been proven in court from whatever speculation is spinning around online. Because if the last several months of the D4vd case have taught us anything, it's that this story has a habit of completely changing shape the second you think you've finally got it figured out. Now I want to know what you think, because this one is genuinely split right down the middle. Knowing that prosecutors sat through 18 days of grand jury testimony across 3 separate panels and still chose not to seek an indictment against D4vd, what does that actually tell you? Does it sound like a case with cracks in it, or does it sound like a prosecution team deliberately playing the long game, holding evidence back until they can use it exactly when it counts most? Drop your take in the comments below and let's argue it out, and once you're done, go watch our full breakdown of the arrest and the discovery of Celeste Rivas Hernandez's body, because everything you just heard about these 3 grand juries only really clicks into place once you see exactly how this entire D4vd case began.